Mars 2060 is a podcast designed to be listened to in chronological order. If you're just joining us now, please go back and start with episode 1.
This is Jenna speaking with Deborah Valley from one of the labs on Colony 1. Deborah is a field photographer on the dig site here. She talks about discovering the river rock markings.
I've always loved photography, but I didn't get involved in archaeology until my late 20s, but once I did, I knew there was no going back, and there's nothing more I love than a good mystery. Well, except maybe photographing a good mystery, which actually pretty succinctly sums up my job.
I've been looking through all your photos of the river rock markings. You were there when they discovered them?
Well, we found all 3 boulders with the markings in the same day. But at the time, they didn't stand out much. They appeared to be slash marks, just some surface damage to the rocks. And I took some photos and we moved on and kept looking for clues.
Like a detective.
Exactly. And we were looking for evidence, essentially. A dig site, it's full of questions. And often when we find something new, that piece of information may answer some of those questions, but raise even more. We always approach a site with the same initial one, though. What happened here? And everything we find after that, all the work we do is in service of answering that question.
When did you realize the markings were significant?
At the end of my shift, I went back to my bunk and I sifted through the photos like I always do. But I paused on one that I took looking down at the formation, and 2 of the rocks with markings were pictured. I went to move on to the next photo, but something made me pause. And then I saw it. The 2 sets of markings were almost identical. And it was one of those moments when your brain comes to a halt. I quickly flipped through the other photos and found close-ups of all 3 rocks. I placed them next to each other and I studied them for a moment. My mind was spinning. I thought that something like that, it can't be a coincidence. And I grabbed the tablet and left to find the commander.
What was his response?
He was really quiet at first. I showed him all 3 photos on the screen and I watched his eyes dart back and forth, kind of putting it together in his mind, what it meant. I'll never forget the way he looked at me right before he radioed to the dig site that we were coming out there immediately. I have never suited up so fast in my life. And the commander let me tell everyone what I'd found. And then we went to the nearest set of markings and crowded around it. I could hardly contain myself. Because it's funny. You know, you have to have a mountain of patience when you're doing this kind of work. And the diggers have to move slowly and cautiously to avoid any damage. Moments when everyone's moving quickly are rare. But my heart, it was racing. And we kept stealing glances at each other, knowing that this was really something. And we spread out and started looking at the other sets as well, talking to each other about how interesting it was that they're almost identical. Except there's one set that has a few extra marks at the top, another at the bottom, and the third has neither. So we're standing around just chattering to each other like giddy school kids, like, what do you think it means? And I don't know, it could be anything, like literally anything. And I kept wondering. I couldn't stop thinking about what could cause that kind of damage to the surface of a boulder that's made of such hard material. And with the marks being so similar, are they intentional? For what purpose, you know? The mind really starts to wander.
Yeah, of course.
But that's the really exciting part of my job. Just each little piece we find inspires speculation and it pushes the plot along. Being a part of the discovery and helping to tell the story of what happened is a complete and total thrill. We investigate and research and relentlessly sift through the details looking for the truth, and sometimes all that effort, it turns up nothing, but sometimes it turns up everything.
I guess that's where all that patience comes into play.
Absolutely. You don't last long in the field without it. There's just a lot of disappointment to manage. There are a few people who help with the dig. They have main jobs elsewhere around the hab, and they get frustrated sometimes with the long days and hard work that we walk away from empty-handed. But one time, Kate, she's our field supervisor, and she was explaining to them that sometimes finding nothing is just as important as finding something.
Do you think there's any truth to that, or was she just trying to get them to be quiet?
No, it's absolutely true. For example, once we found all the markings, everyone was searching for others. And our diggers were meticulously uncovering every boulder and rock, hoping to find more. So far, we've come up with nothing. It's still just the 3, but we've plotted them on our field maps and are trying to determine why there are only 3 and what the purpose is of their locations. The rocks that don't have markings have a lot to tell us about the ones that do.
So things are starting to come together.
Well, we're a long way off of knowing what caused them. When people got sick and they forced us to close the dig site, we got set back pretty far. That was frustrating. I mean, we had to stop what we were doing and allow all our work we had done for over a year to sit there, not knowing what the outside elements might have been doing to damage what we'd uncovered. We pleaded our case, but in the end we had to listen to Commander Whitfield.
Was that hard to accept?
You have no idea.
What did you do during that time?
Well, we went over and over the reports and the photos, and there are, of course, many theories floating around.
Like what?
Well, it's possible that some object, an element of nature that was common to this area, could have caused the damage, or it could have been a microorganism, insect, or even an animal of some sort.
What's your money on?
I'm not much for betting, but I do have a favorite. Now, there's no proof of this, but it's possible that an intelligent being created these markings intentionally as some form of communication. Maybe they're signs, which could mean that this waterway was perhaps often traveled, or there was something about it that was important to be communicated to others.
Other what?
Good question. I mentioned earlier that one of the major questions we have when we approach a dig site is, what happened here? Another important question is, who was here?
This is Megan with Alicia Chase. Alicia was one of the chemists on Colony 1, now stationed back at the ISA in DC. She talks about the difficulties of living in such a confined space.
Sometimes the walls feel pretty tight, you know. I remember one time right before moving to the permanent hab, I hadn't been outside in over a month.
Is that normal?
For us, it wasn't so strange. It all depended on your job. My job didn't require going outside. I usually didn't go that long, but I'd been so busy. My friend Jace, he's one of the astrobiologists. He'd tell you I was getting punchy. He always knew when I needed a break. That particular time, he passed me a note at breakfast that said, "We're going on an adventure. Suit up."
You could just leave whenever you wanted?
Not exactly. We had to coordinate with other crew members so they knew where we'd be. Jace had work to do outside of the hab, and he couldn't do it alone. So I would get to go along sometimes. It helped settle my brain.
Where did you go that time?
We had been exploring this area nearby that had interesting geological features, and Jace needed to get some rock samples from it.
Did you have to travel far?
It was a couple hours away. We took one of the expedition vehicles. I loved driving those things.
I would think it could be frightening to be so far from home base. Like a ship at sea when you finally lose the shoreline.
We lost the shoreline when we left Earth. But yeah, I know what you mean. Honestly, I loved it. I don't know that I can stress enough how tough living in those habs can get. You can only walk so far before hitting a wall. Getting to be out in nature, even if it's Mars's version, helped me like nothing else could.
What was it like? What did it look like?
The first things that caught my eye were these strange hills. They looked kind of like bubbles, as if something under the surface had pushed them up. They were just on the inside of a shallow crater. We parked the EV at the edge of the crater and hiked down. The rocks were loose, so there was a bit of slipping and sliding.
Did it take a while to collect the samples?
It's pretty quick. The drive takes longer than getting the samples. While Jace got those, I played. I don't know if you've ever taken a dog to an open field or a dog park before and let them loose, but the way they run around, like it's the most glorious feeling in the world. That's what I felt like. There were no walls to stop me.
How hard is it to run in your spacesuit?
Not easy or graceful. More shuffling than running, but it can be done.
Those odd-looking hills that you mentioned, were they also being considered as unnatural or, what would you call it, alien-made or, I don't know, Martian-made?
No, we were researching the different minerals in the crater. I'm not sure if anything here is alien-made. We were trying to understand how the surface features were formed. What we know about the history of Mars is so minimal. We're making leaps and bounds now that we're on the surface, but there's so much to learn.
You think the rock formation the team is studying is just a natural occurrence?
I'm still waiting for concrete evidence in all this, you know?
So you're not a believer?
It's not that. I think it would be awesome to find confirmation of life or past life on Mars. But as of now, I'm still not convinced. I'm just someone who needs proof. Yes, there's water here, but that doesn't equal life. We're pretty certain Mars had a volatile beginning. Basalt makes up a lot of the rock here. So we know there was volcanic activity. We know there were earthquakes. I'm just not convinced that anything could have survived here. At least any intelligent life. It's not a friendly planet.
But maybe it's just not friendly towards humans. Couldn't an alien life form have lived happily on Mars if it were born there?
I'm just looking for the proof. I'm not saying no. I guess I'm saying, if some being created that rock formation, why is there no evidence or organic material left behind? Where did they go?
This is Megan speaking with Michael Wills from his office in Maryland. Michael was one of the structural engineers who was part of the team that built the underground habitat. He discusses what it was like to finally open the underground structure after almost 2 years of living in the temporary halves on Mars.
The main structure of the habitat was made primarily of basalt. There's a lot of it on Mars. It's a very dense rock.
It sounds cave-like. Is it really dark down there?
We used a lot of electricity for artificial light, but we also had natural light too.
How did that work?
Picture what anthills look like. They have openings on the surface. That's where we installed the windows, to be like skylights.
So how big was the structure?
3 floors high. The kitchen and greenhouse were on the top, labs, infirmary, and rec room second floor, and sleeping quarters were on the lower level.
I didn't realize that you had included the greenhouse in the underground structure. I had assumed it was always separate, on the surface.
Oh, yep. It was on the top floor, and it had a large dome ceiling. Initially, we planted potatoes and lettuce. They were testing the soil of what combination of Mars soil and Earth nutrients would be the most successful for hardy plants. Finding the balance was key. The Martian soil alone lacks important nutrients for growing, but it does a nice job of holding on to the water.
Always looking for ways to conserve water.
That's right.
So did the different departments bond, or were you all one big group? like did the botanists sit with the botanists for meals and the structural engineers sit with each other?
You mean like elementary high school?
Exactly.
No, we mixed it up. We moved into the permanent housing. My bunkmates were a cook, a nurse, a chemical engineer, and myself. The excavation team usually chose to share rooms with each other, but we all sat together for meals. Everyone was really close.
So what was move-in day like after almost 2 years of work?
It was actually the night before that I remember pretty clearly. Our team had finished the final tests. We had turned off all the lights and just kept on our headlamps. It was late. We stood in the center of the building, and Rebecca reached over, and she took my hand. And then I took the hand of the person to my right. Now, I'm not usually a huggy, feely type emotional person, which you probably guessed, but something just came over me. We all held hands in a circle. We turned off our headlamps and looked up through the skylight to the stars, and it was so quiet. The next day, we all moved in, and the rest of the crew threw us this big surprise thank you party. So everyone had prepared foods that were special to them. It was a big sort of potluck. Our crew was from all over, and everyone wanted to share their version of comfort food. None of us will forget that night for many reasons. I try to focus on the good stuff. I remember biting into this strawberry dessert and thinking, man, we are finally living on Mars. Sitting in our new dining room I helped build and eating a homemade meal. It felt like we made it.
This is Megan with Scott Weimer, an electrical engineer from Colony 1, speaking to him from ISA headquarters in DC. He discusses how he first learned doctors were starting to quarantine patients who were getting sick and coping with the loss of his fellow crew members.
I'll tell you that a lot of the things we thought could go wrong didn't. Some of them did, and we dealt with it. But for over 2 years, we were fine. And then we weren't. It was hell.
What do you...
No, that's it. I don't want to be here. I think this was a mistake.
Scott, wait.
Do you have any idea what it's like to be asked about this all the time? You know, when I first came home, I couldn't leave my front door without some reporter in my face wanting to know how I was dealing with things, or if I thought someone was to blame. Can you believe that? Bunch of nut jobs. Everyone's got something to sell, and everybody's got an angle, okay? So what's yours?
I don't have an angle. I mean, if you really don't want to be here, I can't force you. Why did you come?
Sarah, my psychologist, told me you weren't that bad. She thinks I should talk about it more.
Will you sit?
No, but I will stay for now.
Thank you.
I bet you talked to a lot of people from my team who seem just fine, haven't you?
Well, no one seems just fine. But if anyone's been struggling a lot, they haven't divulged that to me.
Of course not. I mean, astronauts never want to talk about any mental problems they're having, because they could be deemed unfit for flight. Going into space is what they live for, so they lie.
Do you mind talking about the problems you've been having? You don't work for the ISA anymore, right?
No, I don't. And yes, I mind talking about my problems. But I'm not afraid of you knowing that I'm still struggling. There's a difference.
Okay. Do you see Sarah regularly?
Well, I have to see someone. I tried going it alone when I first got back, but I couldn't function. I'd leave the house and see the faces of my friends who passed away. I crashed my car 2 weeks after I got back because I thought I saw Michelle walking down the sidewalk. I couldn't stop staring, and the next thing I knew, there was a telephone pole coming at me.
Do you mean your assistant, Michelle Hernandez?
Yeah. She and I worked closely together. She was one of the first to get sick.
Could you tell something was wrong when she first took ill?
Not really, but I told her to go to the infirmary just to be safe.
Did they treat her?
Yeah, they gave her extra vitamins and assigned her 2 days of rest. Look, we took different precautions out there, all right? When you live and work in such close quarters with people, germs spread like wildfire.
What was she like when she came back to work?
Still sick, all right? Her symptoms didn't seem much worse at first, but looking back on it now, I guess she seemed more tired. A few days later, she was back in the infirmary, hooked up to an IV because she was dehydrated.
What did the doctors think at that point?
I don't remember, okay? I went to visit her after she'd been in the infirmary for a week, and she wasn't getting better. She still looked okay to me, but something seemed off.
How do you mean?
Something wasn't right. I woke up that night in a cold sweat, and I knew what it was. She was just scared. The next time I went to visit her, there was a lot more people in the infirmary with symptoms similar to Michelle's. And the medical staff was moving around a little faster, and whispering to each other. It was just uncomfortable.
Could you hear what they were saying?
Well, I had to go to Dr. Otis's office one day to fix something. The room was empty when I got there, so I just started working. A few minutes later, she was walking towards her office with one of the nurses, and they were talking about quarantining people. I mean, I dropped my screwdriver, and they saw me, and Dr. Otis said that it wasn't as bad as it sounded, and everything was probably going to be fine. She told me not to spread around what I'd heard, and that they were just making sure plans were in place as a precaution.
Why are you shaking your head?
Well, because at the time, I let her words comfort me.
How was Michelle the last time
Listen,
you saw
I don't want to talk about that. I need to go. Don't contact me again.
Scott.
No.
Scott, wait.
Next time on Mars 2060.
By the time we had about 10 people sick, we were escalating procedures significantly.
Then I got a message from Maria, saying she had caught it too.
I found out that the first 3 had fallen into comas when I woke. What could I do? I was watching my future.